Welcome everybody to the new Lyre podcast. I'm here with my guest, Matthew Ehret, who is a journalist who specializes in intelligence and geopolitical matters. He's the founder of the Canadian Patriot website, and he's also a co-founder of the Rising Tide Foundation, which is a nonprofit organization dedicated to enhancing intercultural dialogue and understanding with a special focus on the arts and sciences. So we have a very fascinating guest today. Welcome, Matthew.
Thanks for having me on, Dave.
And today we're going to be talking about Edgar Allan Poe, which I think is really a critical subject when it comes to the question of the arts and culture today. And I think we just have to state it outright. The arts and culture are in a crisis right now. There is a crisis in popular culture. There is a crisis in poetry. There's been a certain arc of development, starting with the advent of modernism, which sort of broke with the classical tradition as it had been represented best, I'd say, by people like Percy Bysshe Shelley, John Keats, Edgar Allan Poe, and before that, Shakespeare, Dante, Homer, and everything sort of revolves around these kinds of titans. There's all sorts of different kinds of poets, different kinds of artists, which have drawn on some of these seminal poetic geniuses throughout history. And with modernism, there was sort of a break with that, and we were going to do something different. Mm-hmm. And we've discussed all the problems and paradoxes with that in previous podcasts. So I think today it's really important to get at this question. Who was Edgar Allan Poe really? Because in popular culture, till this day, the image of Edgar Allan Poe is largely reduced to this cartoonish, Halloween-like figure of the macabre, which we pull out every October to sort of feel all spooky and feel all sorts of strange feelings and just have a bit of novelty to throw into our mix of the daily grind. But Edgar Allan Poe is actually one of the greatest poets, not because he spooked people with all sorts of Halloween-like themes, but actually because he had a conception of poetry as something that was awakening those deeper faculties within human beings, the creative faculties. And he called this he was referred to this in many of his essays, including on the poetic principle, on the philosophy of composition. And he's always talking about this thirst for immortality, the longing for supernal loveliness. So these are very important concepts, which I think in modern times, people have sort of, let's put it this way, the idea of art today is really just reaction. It's largely reactionary, and it's not really drawing on, or it doesn't really recognize, like a Poe would or a Shelley, that there is something higher within human beings, which is universal, which we can all tap into. And that this universal fount of creativity is really the thing that sets us apart from animals. It's the thing that makes discoveries, right? It's what is associated with what we call inspiration. And Poe understood that if you couldn't awake this within a citizenry, there's no way that you could maintain a republic. There's no way that you could really maintain an advanced civilization if human beings were not able to conceive of beautiful and impassioned conceptions in the realms of the arts. If they weren't in a position to do that, then they weren't really going to be able to pursue that in the real world. The realm of the arts was really the ground zero for sort of inspiring and communicating ideas. So I think I've gone on long enough, and I apologize for that. but there's a lot of layers that we have to uncover, Matthew.
Yeah, absolutely. No, and I don't think you went on too long at all. I think that it's very important that people at least get that idea, that essence of Poe before we actually start unpacking things a little bit. And indeed, you know, you brought up the master of the macabre, this perverse image that people popularly encounter every Halloween of Poe, which is a real perversion and derailment of any understanding of what Poe actually was himself, how he saw himself, and what he did, what he contributed to the wealth of human knowledge on almost every field of the arts and also of sciences. And I think that a big part of this has to do with the fact that we are, in our society currently, we're in many crises, and many of those crises and our inability to resolve those crises, whether it's the danger of civil war inside of the United States currently, which I think a lot of people on the left and on the right are thinking seriously about, the world is watching. You know, we have certain issues of war. Thermonuclear war is a real danger. I mean, you know, nations have been encircled by the United States increasingly over the last several years, which is part of a real game of nuclear chicken that nobody should be playing. But our inability to resolve these and many other problems has to do with our ignorance of universal history and the actual long-term processes that shape the context in which we find ourselves, which is universal historic processes. And people often find it very difficult because of the education system, you know, a lot of the assumptions that we're fed in our current zeitgeist. They find it difficult to think how events that happened 100 or 200 or 300 years ago or more are actually causally affecting the world that they live in. So to understand Poe, one needs to really understand that the United States itself, in which he situated himself as an epistemological warrior and defender from a very early age, but the United States itself arose as a very new phenomenon of how to organize society, how to organize our idea of law that we enact for our own self-government, that the founding fathers, especially Benjamin Franklin, who many could say was the father of founding fathers, this was recognized as the creation of a new type of human being that, for the first time, rather than being seen as human cattle under a feudal lord's estate or monarchy's estate under hereditary institutions where your children and grandchildren would be condemned to the same fate that you lived, which includes also the elite as well, born into a noble class. They would be sort of always, your bloodline was seen as the validation of your authority to rule over the many. Right. That type of stratification of society was seen as obsolete finally, and the manifestation of that was in the form of the creation of the Declaration of Independence that enshrined a nation under God, as though every human being, it was built on the understanding that every human being was sovereign, had inalienable rights, and these were endowed by their creator. And so rights were not given to the masses. They were there already. And the idea was that for this to endure beyond the generations of those who fought and died for the creation of the Republic, you had to have certain cultural institutions that would ensure that this would not be forgotten, but would be rebirthed and revived with every passing generation. Otherwise, I mean, it's just ink on parchment, right? It would, that society, if it lost the connection to those creative, bold and brave originating principles and ideals that animated that generation that fought, if people lost touch with that in their hearts, what would happen? They would be open for corruption. They would undo a lot of those sacrifices, and ultimately the enemies of the Republic, who never went away after 1776 or 1783 when the Peace of Paris was established, those enemies that represented the old hereditary institutions would take advantage of that weakness and induce the nation to be corrupted from within. So the question of how a real Renaissance culture could be established that would embody the best qualities of the human condition in the arts, in poetry, and literature, that would help maintain that intergenerational continuity, was a very serious thing that many of the founding fathers were thinking about, which is why certain things were created, like the Society of Cincinnati by Alexander Hamilton, in which a young Marquis de Lafayette, who led in bringing in France into supporting the USA, was a leading member of and became a leading figure, which plays into Poe's life very, very seriously 50 years later. But Lafayette, as many know, was the young general with the young age of like 18, came to the United States to fight. And the Society of Cincinnati was set up as an organization that would be open to all children, sons, grandsons of officers of the Revolution. And Edgar Allan Poe's own grandfather, David Poe, was a leading ally and friend of Marquis Lafayette and George Washington, in whose home Marquis Lafayette set up some of his early battles with the British.
This is really something, and I probably didn't actually formally mention that. Yes, you've already given a great presentation, which is what we're in part going to be touching on the political connections, the intelligence connections of Edgar Allan Poe. And I mean, especially today, there's this trend of wanting to sort of separate the artist and his or her work from the world in which they were actually acting in and living in, right? You have this thing, new criticism, which arose with modernism. And the idea was a close reading, that you could forget about the historical, philosophical, political implications or contexts in which something is being written. Just focus on the text, just focus on the words, just focus on the feelings that all these things make you feel. But don't really talk about any sort of external idea which may have been an impetus for the kind of writing, that the quality of writing at a more fundamental level. And so there's been, especially in the 20th century, it's really been entrenched where just look at the text, don't think about all these things. But what you're saying now is that Poe's grandfather, right? What was his name? David Poe?
David Poe
was connected to not only the American revolutionary, I mean, what would you call it? The founding fathers?
Directly? Yeah.
Directly. He was in the army. But Poe was associated with, or Poe had connections, family connections with Lafayette, right? With leaders in the war of the American Revolution against the British Empire.
That's right.
Poe is acting within this context.
That's right.
And I think it's important. It's not like people have this whole thing with poetry and politics. Nobody's saying that the poetry has to be political per se. And I guess you did throw in quite a few things there about, the geopolitical situation. So I think it's important. We're not a political podcast as such, but we are interested in understanding how the mind of poets, how the mind of a creative genius works. And if you want to look at that without if you want to ignore all historical context, you want to ignore all the historical or all the biographical or every other outside detail other than the literal text or the direct work, sure, you can do that. But we shouldn't be surprised if today there's a fundamental lack of inspiration. There's a lack of purpose in a lot of artists because there's really just there's just feelings, there's novelty. But at a deeper level, the sense of a historical identity, which you can find in a Dante, in a Shakespeare, in a Poe, in a Homer, in a Shelley, in a Keats, in a Beethoven, in a Mozart, they don't have that. They don't see themselves on the stage of history, right? They're saying, these are my feelings. And well, I mean, I can't judge those are your feelings. We all have feelings. It's not like I can judge them on, oh, you have good feelings or bad feelings. No, right? So there are ideas underlying poetry, and we have to be mindful of that. And I think we'll talk about this a bit later, and I'll read. I think it'll be helpful to actually hear some of Poe's works off the page and get a sense of the quality that he was actually reaching for. That in a sense, it is political, or it has major political implications just by virtue of the fact that it's going to awake something within human beings, which is necessary if they're to be able to struggle with concepts like life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, or justice, not as just some word or some construct, but something that, as the American founding fathers, as the Declaration of Independence asserts, are actually ingrained within the universe. These are not just abstract concepts. If you are living in a society that denies its citizens justice, if you live in an oligarchical system, these systems collapse. Every empire has collapsed. And I mean, I'm sure historians today, oh, well, this one collapsed because of this one collapsed because of that. They're just going to sort of go down into the micro and sort of try and come up for an explanation for each one. But very few of them are going to recognize, well, ultimately, these had to collapse because they were going against natural law. And there was no way that you can just run an empire forever, which is some of these utopian type thinkers believe. You can just, we're going to establish this perfect oligarchical system that doesn't change, that, you know, keeps everybody contented.
And I think that we're gonna really jump into that later on in our discussion, where I know you wanted to talk about Eureka as Poe's last and lesser known essay, but probably the most important of the essays that he'd ever written, which he actually called a prose poem, and that gets directly at what you're saying there about the issue of the creative thought of every individual having this potential that has to be actualized in any society morally fit to survive. Those Eurekas have to be made available for every individual to access, in order to feed back into the society's overall ability to exist and succeed in a world of diminishing returns. Because at every moment, whenever you at any fixed set of knowledge base, there's always a certain limited amount of resources that society can draw upon from nature. And if you don't have creative thought constantly animating and reanimating that society, discovering new resources and what have you, that society will always fall into points of increasing tension and ultimately collapses, what you've described every empire sort of slams into. And they can't resolve, how do you maintain control politically while overcoming this limit to growth? They can't do it, and so they ultimately disassociate themselves through inner conflict, inner contradictions, what have you. So we could talk about that and unpack that more later on. But for the current discussion, I think what you were also saying about the new criticism and modernism as just a total mental castration, right? That we've submitted to ourselves in our academic analysis of the arts is really, really insightful. Because the idea that you could extract the personality and the identity of the artist or the scientist, but I guess in the case of new criticism, it applies more to the arts, but that you could extract their identity and how they thought of themselves and what motivated them from the actual effect of their identity and their goals, which was the arts that they created, is just, it's, why would you do that? Like, if you think about, even, I mentioned the sciences, but Ben Franklin was not only the founding father, or the father of founding fathers, but he was also a leading scientist of the world. They called him the Prometheus of America, but he was also a poet with his Poor Richard's Almanac. He really, really was a patron of the arts. He understood this very seriously, this need to create a quality of artistic culture in every field, and worked hard to actually do it in the course of his life and create institutions beyond, which ultimately Poe and many painters even tapped into and really benefited from. But you know, if you try to say, oh yeah, I like his discovery of electricity, but I'm not a fan of his political theory, it's like, well, okay, that's your opinion, but if you actually like look at Ben Franklin's own mind and writings, didn't separate the two. He recognized that in order for his political concepts, his moral concepts to be made realizable, he had to discover something incredibly paradigm shifting in the form of he focused on electricity and what was its nature, that would then allow for an opening of potential to then allow his ideals of having a republic be created. That could then happen, but it had to happen in a lawful way. So his discovery of electricity was part of that. And I think just like Dante Alighieri, you could find his work politically. He was at a certain point one of the highest. He was a very high level political official
within the Florentine Republic. Yeah.
Huh?
Within the Florentine Republic.
Within the Florentine Republic. Yeah, he was like one of the highest political officials, and in his work artistically was totally intermeshed with his understanding that you needed to create a society of citizens that could think for themselves and had a symmetrical, full balance of their minds and emotions,
Right.
in order to process the types of philosophical ideas and ideals that they needed to internalize in order to be sovereign individuals, right, to shape their own destiny. So to simply extract the effects of somebody's life from who they were and what motivated them is just, it's either incompetent or criminal. I think if you knew that this is a lie, but you encourage this type of analysis in the schools for political motives, which is, I think, where this stuff tends to come from if you really dig into things,
Right.
it's bad. So back to Poe.
Well, Matthew, you are one controversial individual here. I want to address our listeners because a lot has been said right there, and I think a lot of it is very nuanced. You know, number one, nobody is espousing some kind of Puritan or moralist dogma that a poet or artist has to have such and such a belief. It's quite the opposite, right? And we need to get into that, but we also mentioned right, I think you put it very nicely when you said you can't divorce the identity from the work. I feel like that starts to get pathological if you want to say that, yeah, this person's sense of identity had nothing to do with what they ended up writing. I'm sorry, but that's just, that's nuts. Right? Your sense of identity is ultimately what informs your behavior and your morals, right? If somebody thinks we're all just animals, we're all just more developed animals, but we're all ultimately just driven by and the product of our instincts and our immediate instincts and impulses, how are you going to behave in society?
Yeah.
Right. What is politics going to be for you? It's just going to be a Hobbesian sort of social Darwinist hellscape, ultimately, right? You're just going to try and get as much as you can for yourself, as much wealth, as much pleasure, as much fame, or whatever it is that gets you going. But it's going to be a society based on those kind of principles, number one, is not going to last long. And I was watching, because we are talking about intelligence and the relationship that poets have had and have always had in terms of their political identities, which in the 20th century we've tried to really disabuse people from exactly this question of forming having an identity that sort of informs your work, or what is the relationship? We can just say that. What is the relationship? Some poets and artists were less political than others, but what we find in all the greatest is their commitment to creativity, their commitment to a certain image of human nature, which is not bestial, right? And it's an image of human nature where we are capable of conceiving of ideas, which are not something material, but something immaterial. And because of that, right, the whole idea of poetry, why would you write poetry? It's because you're trying to address something that you can't talk about in literal terms, that you cannot directly define, but yet exists. And the whole essence of the poetic process or the poetic method is about addressing these higher ideas, whatever they may be. There are hymns to Eros by Sappho, or there are, odes to a Grecian urn by Keats, and there are many ballads by Poe or, Shelley, Keats, which speak to this higher thing. Right? They're trying to find a way to express it. And so that's why they're developing the kinds of poetic language that they are. It's not just because they want to create nice words and beauty, or to the extent that that is the goal. It's because one recognizes that awakens something within. That if you are to recognize something as actually beautiful, which people say is beautiful and are moved by, the only way they could have the ability to experience something like that is if they already had a capacity existing within themselves to recognize it.
Yeah.
Because if they didn't already have if they were just animals, if they were just brutes, right, which did not have such a capacity within them, beauty would not be a thing for them. Nobody would have that, wow, what was that?
But
And
here's
it's
the thing.
glimpses,
Here's the thing, though. The difficult thing to, because a lot of people would hear what you just said, and they would say, well, if you were going to be an artist trying to bring that out, then you would be moralistic or didactic, because you could easily just sound like a priest, you know, telling people what they should or shouldn't be, and, you know, you should be more divine and more
really not what we're
respectful of your virtues. Shame on you if you're not, you know, and there are arts that do that.
That is a problem.
Then that's the problem, right? It really does a disservice to the actual ideal of what you've just set forth. Because so how does a real artist, meritus of the name, actually do that effectively, such that he can invoke, or she can invoke, that type of transformation in individuals who experience their art? It can't be done if they're told that they should or shouldn't do something, or if it's done out of, like, you know, in a Kantian sort of I must be good type of motive. That's just naive. But what they can do, and what they do, whether it's Shakespeare or whether it's Poe, and this is what causes a lot of people to, I think, be a little bit confused about what they're actually doing in their tragedies or in their works of art that result in very dissonant, negative effects and outcomes for the protagonists on the stage or in the short stories, is that they can investigate what happens when a soul is sick, when you have somebody who has potential, but rather than having a well-balanced, integrated persona where they've matured their passions in harmony with their reason, rather than doing that, which would allow them to be creative and have insight and to solve problems, rather than having that type of personality in a Hamlet, or in the case of Poe, as one of the figures from in Descent to the Maelstrom, or The Imp of the Perverse, or many of the other sort of disturbing black cat type of stories. Rather than they have somebody who's out of whack with themselves. They're in contradiction with themselves, right? They tell themselves false narratives, and they lie about what they think they are, and that causes a complete ignorance in insight, and ultimately actions that are motivated by passions that lead to self-destruction, both for the people that they're interacting with as well as themselves ultimately. Whether it's Telltale Heart is a great example, right? That person who killed that old man he was taking care of because that eye was just like looking at him and he just started obsessing over it. Poe is taking you into the mind of this person who's profoundly sick in the head, and he conducts this so-called perfect kill to get rid of the voice in the eye from haunting him, and ultimately at a certain point just breaks down in front of the cops that he invites in for tea, you know, almost taunting fate, and can't stop hearing the throbbing, this beating of this heart, which, you know, you don't know if it's the heart that's he's imagining under the floorboards of the person he killed, or whether it's his own heart. That's the telltale heart. And he ultimately breaks down and effectively admits what he just did. And he's, you know, his life is over effectively, you know. And the same thing, you could analyze that from these first person narratives that he takes you through into the mind of a person who's really sick in the head and sick in the heart in many of these pieces. Shakespeare does the same thing with Hamlet or Macbeth, or any of his tragedies. He's investigating the same thing. So you can then, he doesn't tell you you shouldn't be like that, but he's helping you. He's putting dissonances into the reader's own soul that the reader then cannot just shake off and just walk out as if they just saw a movie and was like, oh, that was entertaining. No, that stays with you, and you have to think about that. And then in the act of thinking about that and vicariously having experienced that person on the stage who acted that way, you find a little bit of that character inside of yourself, usually, if you're sensitive to it. So the idea that Poe is just a perverse figure, or that Shakespeare just loves, you know, horror as well, which people often get slandered by, this is the effect of the assassination of legacy. So rather than killing an individual, which has a sort of sometimes temporal necessary effect in the mind of an imperialist or somebody seeking to dominate the world, they don't tend to enjoy the effect of these Promethean characters who tend to rise up. You know, I mentioned Benjamin Franklin was known as the Prometheus of America, who stole fire from the gods to share it with men. This type of Zeusian personality type that expresses it once themselves in the form of empires. They don't tend to like these Promethean character types that tend to arise, whether it's a Dante, whether it's a Beethoven, whether it's a Poe. And so rather than or a Shakespeare, so rather than just simply killing an individual, which sometimes does happen, what's more useful to them is the killing of the legacy and the memory of that person. So people will read the establishment highly publicized biographies talking about the life and motives of Ben Franklin, the tinkering freak, right, womanizer, and they'll be totally scrambled in the head they won't be able to access through that filter that's been given to them who and what Ben Franklin was. So they won't be able to tap into that source inside of themselves that Ben Franklin himself had tapped into. And it's the same thing for Poe. So there's been a lot. If you look at, you know, you mentioned one of these conferences that both you and I and Cynthia Chung, my wife and co-founder with the Rising Tide Foundation, the three of us, we had this great experience organizing this conference on the Poe You Never Knew a year and a half ago at a university in Montreal. And each one of us, we tackled a different aspect of Poe's life. And people can go to our website on the risingtidefoundation.net and listen to all of those presentations. I tackled the sort of political historical context. Cynthia tackled the case study of the imp of the perverse and what he's doing in that story as one of many stories.
Shakespearean profiles, essentially.
Huh?
Poe's own take on all these different kinds of Shakespearean profiles, right? He's just giving it his own.
Exactly. Yes, exactly. Yeah. And you had taken up the challenge of really just unpacking the underappreciated side of Poe's poetic persona and what he was doing with his insights into the poetic principle. And all three, I think, work together very nicely. But, you know, in my part of the presentation, what I got across and I opened with was that, you know, Poe's legacy is highly contaminated. And even many Poe scholars today agree, they will admit this, that the authoritative biographer who shaped the image that we're currently given of this opium addict fiend obsessed with death and the macabre was actually his own political enemy in life, Rufus Griswold, who devoted, I mean, they were living enemies in their own time in 1842, 1843. Poe died in 1848, or the beginning of 1849, sorry. And, but they were living enemies. So the fact that as the moment Poe died, this figure who hated him, and you could see that in his obituary that was published all across America when Poe died, it's full of venomous hate for Poe, where he basically slanders him that early on. His body is barely even cold. Yeah. And Griswold in this obituary is characterizing him as like a selfish misanthrope who hated humanity and only did things for his own greed and self-serving gain. Like, and yet we're told that Poe granted Griswold the authority to control to be his literary executor and control all of his letters and writings. I mean, my God, why would anybody assume that that's true? And Griswold used this authority to acquire through payment to Poe's mother-in-law all of Poe's letters, all of the writings that existed were all granted to Griswold, believing that he was going to write this beautiful biography. Again, why she would have believed that, that's another question. But of course, at this point, that's the biography that then feeds into generations of researchers year after year. And it's admitted that Griswold lied. Even every Poe scholar today, everyone that I've looked at admits that he lied profusely, that he forged some of the letters. That seems to be also generally agreed upon by most. There's a bit of controversy there, but you actually look at these letters and yeah, a lot of evidence that many of them are forged. And onward and onward. So you're like, why? Why would they work so hard to maintain a false image, a legacy assassination? And so that becomes answerable when you start looking at again, start with the political context. So we were shaping David Poe, right? What is the world going through with the rupture of the Republican Revolution and the creation of this new type of society, premised around a different idea of human nature that awoke different characteristics that were impossible to awaken under a feudal structure of Europe or empire, where there was constant wars of divide and conquer. So Poe, as a young man, he ends up being he's introduced to Lafayette when Lafayette is in the United States, doing a many months long tour organizing. Not only for the victory of John Quincy Adams, who was the only real major serious patriotic Republican intellectual who was fighting for the presidency and fighting to save the United States from its own destruction, which was being orchestrated by figures that I go through in some of my writings. But so Lafayette wants to meet David Poe, but David Poe is dead, right? Poe's grandfather. And so he goes to David Poe's house. A young Poe then is made part of his youth guard, who accompanies Lafayette throughout his entire voyage, where he meets all sorts of revolutionaries who are organizing. These are, again, all members of the Society of Cincinnati that Lafayette is the international leader of at this point, especially for the European side of things. And this changes Poe's life. Immediately after Lafayette returns back to Europe, where he's organizing, Lafayette is in the midst of organizing an international network of movements from Poland and Spain and Germany to shake off the shackles of the Carlsbad decrees and of the Congress of Vienna that had been established at the end of the Napoleonic Wars as a reaffirmation in 1815 in Europe of the necessity to defend monarchical systems of order.
It may be worth making a point and really accenting what you're saying right there. And just for people who don't know what the Congress of Vienna is, what things really look like when Poe is talking about developing a high culture in the American Republic during his lifetime, and the advent of the Congress of Vienna, which is 1814, 1815, right? Yep. Led by all this sort of oligarchical houses and interests of Europe, right? And so what was the state of art, the state of deliberation, right, around profound and passionate conceptions respecting man and nature, as Shelley would say it, around ideas of the beautiful. What did that look like under a Europe under the reign of the Congress of Vienna and the things like the Carlsbad decrees? People need to know about that.
Absolutely, and they don't realize that it was understood then that the arts were the most dangerous of all things politically, which is why after the Congress of Vienna was established and the Holy Alliance was established with these different empires of Europe sort of cohering and agreeing to a new order, they needed to enforce that by the Carlsbad decrees, which in 1819 pretty much banned. It was a massive inquisitional book banning of all unacceptable ideas and thoughts of people like Schiller, like Thomas Paine, like Benjamin Franklin, like any philosopher, any musician. It was hard to listen to Beethoven in those days.
And Keats and Shelley both were very they were shunned in the literary world.
Oh yeah, they didn't get any. They did not make financial profit in their lifetime for most of what they were doing.
Keats was attacked by all the literary magazines. He was totally shunned, by a lot of the so-called, leading romantics, and we're saying was another romantic, but he was in complete. They were in complete opposition to the kinds of poetic approach that Keats had.
Yeah,
people like Lyre,
right. And you see this in the Mask of Anarchy, right? Shelley's Mask of Anarchy, where he's directly calling out Prince Metternich, or is it Castlereagh? Anyway, he's directly calling out the Congress of Vienna in that, and the destruction that's waged as an effect and a consequence of this type of oligarchical organization of society. So yeah, it was very, very much better understood then than it is today, how the arts and politics were intertwined. So
that's the context in which Poe is really passionate about, and I hope you'll say something about it. He went on a lecture tour.
I will. And I just want to read a quote here, because we're at one point just to get across that Poe is self-aware of these two different opposing schools of the arts. I've just pulled out a quote where he makes a point in 1933 when he's now returned from France. There's been the subversion of Lafayette's attempt to create a second French Revolution, to establish a French Republic that failed in 1789, that Lafayette first tried. So this now again is sabotaged. Thus, without France breaking free of empire, Lafayette ended up acquiescing to the idea of Charles the Tenth to be replaced by Philippe Egalité's son, and a new kingship was set up in France with some Republican institutions, but that didn't last long. So the dissolution of that potential that Poe and many other artists, including James Fenimore Cooper, Samuel B. Morse, many others, were all in France at the time, organizing and helping to collaborate around with that destruction. The Polish resistance, the Republican movements there also failed. The followers of Kosciuszko failed, and elsewhere. So there was a disappointment with that, but Poe ended up coming back and carrying out creating a new field of battle in the literary world. And so in 1833, he writes, "When shall the artist assume his proper station in society? How long shall the veriest vermin of the earth, who crawl around the altar of Mammon, the god of lucre, of money, who, be more esteemed of men than they, the gifted ministers to those exalted emotions which link us to the mysteries of heaven? To our own query we may venture a reply. Not long. A spirit is already abroad at war with it." Getting across that you have these two artistic movements, one tied to the love of money, and the other tied to something higher. The cultivation of these exalted emotions that link us to the heavens. Very, very much an opposing type of creativity and a creative movement. And then a little bit later, he writes, "We know," just to get across his understanding of, again, these two systems, "we know the British to bear us little but ill will. We know that in the few instances in which our writers have been treated with common decency in England, these writers have either openly paid homage to English institutions, which is hereditary institutions, or have lurking at bottom of their hearts a secret principle at war with democracy. Now, if we must have nationality, let it be a nationality that will throw off this yoke." So again, he's very clear in his writings where he stands, what his ideal of art is. And you're like, again, how does this mesh with an understanding of the transcendental? Because in his actual arts, in his actual works, he very rarely just simply goes and expresses this divine character of the species. What he does is, like I mentioned earlier, he often showcases where is it absent and what are the consequences of its absence in case studies that then become a domain of play. And it's very interesting to watch. And I think in his poems that you've written about extensively, I think we find the same sort of thing being examined again and again and again. Not always, but very often. The
in
absence
a sense, of the poem, there's more of a positive conception of that, what those higher agencies are, whereas in a lot of the short stories, it's more examples and profiles of what happens when that thing is absent.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, which is pretty interesting. They're different mediums, and they allow for the exploration of different the faculties in different ways. I think that's interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I mean, the fact that he's gone to war with a whole network at the time, if we look at people like Thomas Carlyle, who headed the Edinburgh Review. Thomas Carlyle is known as sort of the founding father of the Transcendentalist movement that spurned on an early supporter, Ralph Waldo Emerson, who Emerson actually described himself as a lieutenant of Carlyle when he stayed at Carlyle's house and also met with Bentham in Britain. And these were figures who were actually saying, both in personal letters and essays, as well as it manifests in their poetic compositions. But there's many quotes where they get across that their ideal of man is not a man that's integrated his individual, unique, sacred identity, his individuality, with the welfare of a whole society. It's not that at all. It's the opposite. In their world, like Thomas Carlyle actually states in 1836 that there is in man something higher than love of happiness, and instead that man must find, instead of happiness, blessedness. This is the everlasting yea, wherein all contradiction is resolved, wherein whoso walks and works, it is well with him. And Emerson, I mean, what is he saying? He's basically saying that happiness is not, it's a false thing to aim for. The real thing we should aim for is just contentedness. And that's the ideal of the healthy peasant who doesn't strive to make anything better, doesn't strive to change the unjust circumstances of their world. And Emerson also makes the case throughout his life that before the Civil War, that it's not our duty to defend a union or a nation. Every individual should just look out for themselves and walk their own personal path, and let the union or the abstract nation that they're a part of dissolve if need be. They will, true men, true self-contained men who are actualized will just naturally create something new and better anyway. So don't fight to save something like the Constitution. Poe was always at war with these
really abstract ideas, right? That's
it essentially doesn't exist. It's purely emotions, direct experience.
Yeah, they're just laughing at anybody that believes in something more than just what they can touch, taste, hear, see, or smell. Right?
Yeah, anybody who's not selfish and not sense-based. Yeah.
Yeah, that and I think it's important to appreciate, because we are talking about poetry, and I feel like a lot of people might be, confused. Like you mentioned, the danger of nuclear war at the beginning of the podcast, right? And all these different political intrigues. And I think people are going to be like, well, what does this have to do with poetry, right? But what we're saying right now is that there is a battle over ideas, right? Whether it's a war, whether it's all sorts of different political, intrigues and scandals, there's a battle over ideas. And I think it's important to look at the empire. Ultimately, yes, you want a population of individuals who cannot think in terms of justice, the pursuit of happiness, cannot conceive of ideals, or fight for immaterial concepts or believe in immaterial context. Just go with what you can touch, taste, see, or smell. And so it's interesting that we always we hear about the Romantic poets, right? But why were Wordsworth, Samuel Coleridge, Byron, these guys had had a great reputation. They were so popular. We're talking about the peasant mentality. And when you read the Romantic works of Byron, Wordsworth, or Coleridge, there's nothing really offensive if you want to have an imperial system. If you want to have a system where, there's largely just, a feudal peasant system, you have a higher class which can appreciate, maybe has a higher taste. But there's nothing that in Wordsworth or Byron or Coleridge that's really going to disturb that. In Shelley, in Keats, yes. And in Poe, ultimately, just like I was saying, that the empire really wants to reduce people to just what they can touch, taste, hear, see, or smell. But when you read something like Poe, right, when you read even some of his early poems, there's something more, right? There's definitely something there, something beyond, something in the distance, he says, right? There's something beyond what you can touch, taste, hear, see, or smell. And he's arousing that within us, within his reader, and they can't really deny it, even if they can't put it into words. And this is often the case that, I think our language has greatly suffered, and to the degree that we are not informed by great poetry, we can often lack the kind of language, lexicon, to speak about higher ideas, higher poetic concepts in the way that someone like Poe was able to defend, or in the way that someone like Shelley was able to defend, and in the way that ultimately those same kinds of quality of poetic ideas is what you found in the Declaration of Independence: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And that's what really pissed off the empire. You spoke of Bentham, Carlyle, this whole network also around Lord Shelburne, right? That these guys really wanted to destroy the idea of a republic. And Bentham actually came out attacking the Declaration of Independence, specifically life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, because they were imprescriptible rights.
Yeah.
Right. There was no concrete sort of, well, how do you decide who has, what is life, liberty? There was no sort of objective metric, i.e. something sensual, by which you could measure it against. And if you can't measure it against some material or sensual standard, you can't, it's considered immeasurable.
Yeah.
But Poe develops in his Eureka, in his, ultimately the essence of his poetry is defining something that, no, you are able to measure higher concepts. They're incommensurable with objects of sense, but just because you cannot measure them against something sense perceptual, it doesn't mean that they're not attainable through what Poe is really talking about as the poetic sentiment, right?
Do you want to talk about Eureka a bit?
A certain mood. Yeah, sure. You know what? I mean, I feel like we could go on with the Poes. I would encourage everybody, let's do it this way. We're going to link to your presentation on the historical personality of Edgar Allan Poe, his connections to the intelligent networks around the American Revolution. And just by people watching that, you just have to ask yourself, there's so much fascination around Poe. How come none of the scholars, why doesn't anybody talk about this?
Yeah.
Why are we 200 years later? And it's only really now that, I think in your presentation, you bring it together in a way that I've never seen done before. And you mentioned some of the people whose work you use, but I really recommend to all our listeners to go listen to Matthew's class on the Edgar Allan Poe. You never knew. And we're going to link to it at the bottom. So
we'll also link into the thing that got a lot of those ideas that helped put me on that path was the pioneering work of Alan Salisbury, who just published some just incredible research back in the 70s and 80s on this. And we can link in that. I guess you can link that in the description too to his works.
Yeah, so we're going to make all that available. And that'll allow us to just go on to this question of Eureka. So we're talking about these higher concepts, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Poe talks about supernal loveliness, right? And the poetic mood, the poetic sentiment, which is not just in poetry. I think just to disabuse anybody from the idea we're somehow talking about something that is particular to a written text or to, a spoken word. No, you find it in painting. You find it and Poe says this, you find it in architecture, you find it in even the curious case of the landscape garden, as Poe points out. And most especially, you find it in music. Yeah. And music has no words, right? If we're talking about, a Beethoven composition, a Beethoven symphony, but it's just as palpable. It's actually more palpable, Poe says, in music than it is in poetry. So, this poetic sentiment, it has a universal characteristic. And so in Eureka, he is writing a prose poem which turns to the question of science.
Yeah, right? Exactly.
But it's interesting to see that the terms and the kind of lexicon that he uses to describe poetry, it's very closely related when he starts to take up the subject of science. And I'll let you talk about it, but he makes some crucial points by exposing the fallacy of the sort of traditional idea of scientific thinking. And that was intentionally imposed on people, that was intentionally imposed into the education system to make people stupid. Pardon my French. But ultimately, if we put ourselves in the role of an oligarch or some sort of imperial manager, if you're smart at all, you understand that we do need to keep people stupid. We can't really allow for a discussion of higher ideals. Like
I love the fact that you're just saying that. No, because that's bold to say that, and it's true. That because it's a paradox. It seems like, how can you educate people to be dumb? Isn't that a contradiction in terms? Once you're educated, you're not dumb anymore. But And this is the smoke and mirrors game that we've all had to, every generation we've had to struggle with this. Some generations have been able to understand it and navigate through it better than others. Poe definitely understood it and navigated through it very effectively, and gave us, in especially the Eureka essay you just mentioned, gave every generation the best tools to help navigate that foggy water. Because he zeroes in this essay on the figures of John Stuart Mill, Jeremy Bentham, directly. He's directly calling them out and getting at the point that it's there's two modes of thinking that are both false modes that keep us from the right path that gets us to Eurekas. That's why he calls the whole thing Eureka. A Eureka, what is that? I mean, this is a word that, who was it? Archimedes had, back 2,000 years ago or more, when he discovered a way to measure the density of gold when he was sitting in a bathtub. And so that was the Greek word for, I think I got it or something. I'm not even too sure. But anyway, it's a word that was created and popularized, and it's associated with that aha. I didn't know something, now I know it. There is that in-betweenness, and it's that moment in between being in a state of ignorance to being in a state of knowledge. That's the Eureka sort of metaphor. So what are the two paths, he says, that derail us, that seem like knowledge? And he calls one creeping and the other crawling. One is the path of deductive thinking, the other is the path of inductive thinking. We're told that these two modes of logic, one which arose, as he says in his essay, from the thinking of Aristotle that he calls Aristotle, and the other from Francis Bacon, who really popularized the opposing mode that he calls the hog, Bacon, hog, later on. One is otherwise known as a priori thinking, the mode of Aristotle, of induction. The other is a posteriori thinking, the mode of deduction. A priori is where you start with rules that you cannot verify if they're true, but you have to start with certain rules, and then those rules allow you to navigate through the world of phenomenon with your senses, that you then take sensory data of whether it's the positions of the planets or whether it's the growth of plant life or whatever. You just plug in the data you're measuring or weighing into categories of experience that are shaped by those rules that you assume abstractly are true, that then allows you to judge meaning, value, and whatever else that you decide if you're, let's say a scientist, a biologist, or a political philosopher.
For example, for example, in a perfect Aristotelian example, the universe is perfect, right? And perfection is that which doesn't need any more improvement. So a universe that is perfect is going to be a universe that, number one, doesn't change, right? Because if it's changing, that means you're getting worse or better, and that's not perfect. So, from that, well, what is the most perfect of shapes? Circle, movements are circular movements. They're the most even. So planets have to move in circles, right?
Exactly.
And these are all a priori assumptions.
Exactly.
Sort of coming up in our head, and then we'll say, well, the universe, it has to be this way because X, Y, Z.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And if you believe in that, then you're forever going to be incapable of discovering the true elliptical nature of planets. If you believe in that, to the degree that you hold on to that.
The reality is Aristotle never discovered anything with that method.
That's important to think about. He's famous for his philosophy, but people say, oh yeah, but he was wrong and everything's scientific. Yeah, well, that's a big deal. So the opposing view of Bacon that came up much later in the 1600s, and this was popularized, and this basically asserted, no, it's the opposite case. What we have to do is we have to have a posteriori. So we start with our sensory data. We look for patterns that might arise in our sensory data. And when we find those patterns, right, from the five senses, then we can extrapolate a universal generality, a law that we assume thus exists as a linear extrapolation from those patterns of the senses. Now that, both of them can be used, and Poe makes the point that they're both useful. You don't want to just cut one off and not do the other, but you can't limit yourself to either one or any combination of the two without something additional. And if you try to do that, then you will not only cut off your creative reason, your ability to make those types of leaps that are nonlinear transcendental leaps into the unknown discovery principle that you're looking for, but politically, economically, you will result in the same paradoxes that people like John Stuart Mill or Bentham or any of the British establishment
utilitarian.
Those empiricist economists will tend to find themselves in the same Malthusian paradox of overpopulation, that you're always going to fall under a problem over time where your population will exceed your capacity to sustain that very population, resulting in necessary wars over the scarcity of resources, mass starvation over the lack of ability to sustain, yada, yada. And it becomes a bit of a Pygmalion effect, right? Because an empire can't tolerate creative thought because that creates conditions where individuals emerge like a Benjamin Franklin, not from the hereditary class, but from the poor, who then understand how to think critically and insightfully about the future and about human nature, and then they, God forbid, communicate that to others or inspire others. That's intolerable. But at the same time, you can't overcome the population catastrophe. And so their solution is population control, and things like the Carlsbad Decrees and the Congress of Vienna was a good example of one form of that that we touched upon earlier. So Poe's Eureka, I mean, again, this is, you got to look at it in context, because people, this is often when you buy a compiled works of Poe, very, very infrequently does it include this last piece that Poe considered the greatest, most important piece of work in his lifetime.
Right.
It rarely includes that. You can find it online. But when you actually look at what was Poe doing when he died his mysterious death in 1849, he was in the midst of doing a nationwide lecture tour under the theme of the cosmogony of the universe. Very bold. And he was doing this to raise money, subscription funds, for a new magazine that he was going to set up called The Stylus. It was actually you who put me onto this last year. And it's fascinating when you actually look at his writings, his works about his intention for The Stylus. There's drawings, he did thumbnail sketches of what the cover would look like, what it would be involved in it. And for the first time, he would not be an editor for somebody else's magazine, like the Southern Literary Messenger or something like that, or Graham's Magazine, but rather he would be the controller of the entire epistemology of a magazine for the first time. And so he was en route back from Virginia, where he was conducting his last lectures, going through the nature of mind, its parallels with and harmonies with the nature of God's mind, of the mind that created the laws of the universe. Very, very bold thesis. And he's on his route back with money in hand to New York to set up his magazine that he said would be the most important endeavor of his life, unless he died before it was accomplished. But he said, certainly if I don't die before it's accomplished, this will be the most important thing I will have ever done, and I will do it. And that's me almost directly paraphrasing. Like, that's exactly what he says. However, he dies en route. I think he's in Baltimore or something when he's en route back to New York. And, he's discovered basically drugged up, wearing somebody else's clothes in the back alley of some place, and brought into a hospital, cut off from all of his friends, family. Nobody's allowed to see him. He's held up there for several days, where he dies. If so, you actually look at what is he doing. These lectures and this essay is what he calls the manifesto for his magazine. And that magazine is designed to unite analyses of fine arts, of poetry, of literature, and of political history, all in one unifying field, one unifying package. Really an important concept. And this is sort of what Ben Franklin was doing earlier with the Poor Richard's Almanac, or Schiller was doing with the Thalia magazine. But, all of these great cultural warriors, they are all in the midst of doing things like this to upgrade the quality of the culture as a whole, so that people can be prepared for the types of political battles and insights that they need to have. Now, insight is an important thing, because what is insight? Where do you define it, deductively or inductively? It's more than the two. It's something that, you have a sense of the essence of something's being. That's insight. and you can
it's not sense perceptual.
It's not sense perceptual. No.
So it's a site of what? I think it's important to sort of appreciate the idea that we're talking about sight of something that you cannot see or experience with your senses.
Mm-hmm.
That's a very upsetting concept for most people. For a lot of people, or I shouldn't say most people. I say people who have gone through the traditional standard education system, not just of today or the last 10 years, but really for many decades now. They're very uncomfortable dealing with these kinds of metaphysical concepts. In fact, it's treated as its own obscure category, when in fact, for all these great geniuses, whether it's Poe, whether it's Mozart, whether it's Dante, Shakespeare, this is what they're really concerned with. Insight, right? How do we generate insight, artistic insight?
Because it's seeing with understanding. So you're not seeing with your eyes, you're seeing with your mind's eye, you're seeing through your understanding of a process. And that's also where the domain of a higher level of playfulness can arise. So you can have like the improvs of a Bach, composing these incredible royal themes, and his entire well-tempering system that came out of his and his fugues came out of this playfulness. And people are awe-inspired. Like, how does somebody improvise something like that? Mm-hmm. And it comes through work, through an understanding of technique. Of course, you need these things, but at a certain point, if you're doing it with a proper, honest spirit, you come to a deeper penetration of the principles that organize what you're playing with, and then you could play with them, and you can discover things and combinations and dissonances, and how dissonances can combine with harmonies that have a certain effect in some way that makes people who also are exposed to your art better in some way, right? It doesn't mean that you make them better people in like I've made a robot, but you enhance their ability to harmonize their inner self with their higher self, right? Their physical self, their fleshly self with their higher spiritual divine self, and access those universal emotions, these that connect us with the divine that Poe talks about. And I would just like to say two things, giving two examples. I thought was just great in Poe's works that do this in a very direct way. And the one you have his short story Descent of the Maelstrom. And in the Descent into the Maelstrom, it's a wonderful example of this, where he doesn't talk about it, he just does it. And what you have is like these two brothers who are actually, I think there's a third brother, but they're at sea in a fishing boat, and all of a sudden they're caught in a maelstrom. A big giant vortex opens up in the sea, and it's pulling everything in. And it's a slow, scary process of circling down into the center of this hole in the whirlpool that's just eating up everything going in. And there's a contrast between the states of insight and spiritual disposition of the two brothers, where one brother just totally loses his shit and is dominated by the fear of this immense hostile sense perceptive storm and environment. And he loses his shit to the point that he pushes his other brother, who's holding on to a stable hook in the middle of the boat to be stationary. I think one brother at this point just already got, he's holding on to a pole and got pulled in. He already got blown off and was killed. So there's two brothers now. The one pushes the other brother off. Now the other brother is like loosely flailing around the boat, and this other brother almost kills his other brother, right? Because he's losing his stuff.
Right, and I remember the story. Yeah, go on.
Yeah, and the other brother is different. He actually is maintaining control of his mind, and he's observing what's going on, and he actually takes the time to recognize that the heavier trees and everything else in the whirlpool with their boat is being sucked down faster and faster into the center. But he sees that some of the lighter driftwood that's also circling only circles down, but then circles back up again. And he tries to communicate this to his other freaking out brother. And the other brother can't hear anything, just pushes him away again, almost kills him again. And he's like, well, I can't interact with him anymore. And he just jumps off the boat and holds on to a barrel or a very light piece of wood. And as he is not going down into the center, he's constantly just at a stationary circling position. He's watching his other brother, who's holding on for dear life and freaking out, collapse into the center and die. So he has that Eureka moment because he's able to maintain his composure, and his inner soul is able to not be moved irreparably by the storms and turmoil about him. And so that's the thing, that's the insight, right?
There's two fundamentally different kinds of thinking is what Poe's really demonstrating. The one person, the other brother, he has just, and we can all understand it, he has a primal reaction. Yeah. His primal instincts, his survival instincts, fight or flight, really it's the most primal. I mean, it's not very developed, but it's also in a sense the most ingrained, right? Yes. Because it happens at such an automatic level. But the point is that this person isn't really able to think beyond those sort of automatic impulses that just kick in because you are in danger. Exactly. And I mean, if you're trying to run, again, I like if you're a rich, evil oligarch or an imperialist, you want people to maintain that kind of sort of just brutish, primal sense of identity, where it's like, well, he had no choice, he was going to die if he didn't do something. So yeah, I guess I would have to let my brother die as well, and it always these kind of closed system, binary choices. You either act like a brute and survive, or you try and be virtuous and you die. It's very fun to be. There's this whole idea of just laughing at people who have some higher sense of awfulness, right? Yeah. Like you're dead because you believed in these farcical ideas. Look how stupid you are for not acting like a primal brute, like a pig that's about to be.
And ironically, right, the second you start focusing on your own personal self-interest and you're, and you live in this fight or flight survival mode, you're less equipped to actually survive.
Yeah,
in a way only a human could.
Yeah, right? And so the other guy actually discovers what we could call a human quality of reasoning.
Yeah.
Which is actually what allows him to get out of the crisis. And I mean, how is that not relevant to the kind of political situations that we've seen throughout history that we see today?
Yes.
Do we want people reacting with this kind of brutish, sort of primal mindset? Or do we want people to actually make a leap, to have a Eureka moment, right, in how they view the world? And this is what becomes insight, right? All of a sudden things appear differently.
Yes.
Because there's an insight into a higher possibility.
Exactly. Now I got a quick question for you. How long do you have for this podcast? Because I've got a couple of Eureka punchlines I want people to experience, but I don't want to go on too long either. So how?
I mean, where am I going? Welcome to lockdown world. We're having fun. We're talking about important matters.
Okay.
And so go on. And I think I can read a poem, one of the poems that I want to read at the end to sort of culminate what you're trying to show with Eureka and how this sort of beautifully just naturally unfolds in even
all right, let's do that. So so I won't go with the second case study, but people should read Inspector Dupin's stories, or the stories of Inspector Dupin, and especially the Purloined Letter, to get another example of this seeing with insight and what Inspector Dupin says at one point when he was able to discover what no one else was able to discover, and his assistant is like, how are you doing this? And he said, well, I knew the nature of the person who conducted this crime. And if he was a mathematician, I know that he couldn't have reasoned well at all. And if he was just a poet, he couldn't have also reasoned very well. And in both cases, he would have been susceptible. His crime would have been discovered by those police officers who are using this deductive and inductive mode of rigorous logic, but that's not getting them anywhere. He's like, but I know that he studied the infinitesimal calculus and he was a poet. And because of that, I knew how he thought. And because of that, I was able to do what they were not able to do. And so people want to get the answer to that. They got to read the Purloined Letter, which they should do after this podcast. However, we're talking about Eureka. So in the Eureka, after he gets at the fallacies of these two methods of thinking, creeping and crawling, he says that the key thing here is that you're imposing these onto a species of man that whose true nature wants nothing more than to soar. And he gives us a case study of a successful example of this type of soaring beyond the two modes of reasoning the case of Kepler directly. He talks about Kepler in his book,
Right.
And how Kepler used a form of intuitive leap. He calls it a guess, but it's really more than that. And he talks about that into the harmonies, the musicality of the space-time of the universe that organize the positions of the orbits around the sun as a central moving force in elliptical positions, right?
Right.
Kepler's discovery, his third law, emanates from his ability to discover that the ratio of the aphelion and perihelion, the closest and furthest positions of planets from the sun, and the speed at which they're moving at the slowest and fastest moments, have a certain relationship. All planets together have a certain harmonic relationship of cubic mean distances to the square of the periodicities, and that is what allowed Kepler that leap to discover his third law. And so Poe zeroes in on this Keplerian approach, which is very different from these two opposing schools of Aristotle and Bacon, which manifested in the world of Leibniz versus Newton earlier on. Newton, who there's a lot of evidence to showcase that Newton really stole a lot of the discoveries he's famous for from people like the calculus, from people who were Keplerian Platonic thinkers like Leibniz, who also comes up in Poe's essay. And so Poe says, okay, if we are made in the image of the creator, then we have to understand how poetry and science work together. And he opens up in his preface saying, I offer this book of truths. This is Poe saying, I offer this book of truths, not in its character of truth teller, but for the beauty that abounds in its truth, constituting it true. To these I present the composition as an art product alone, let us say as a romance, or if I be not urging too lofty a claim, as a poem. What I here propound is true, therefore it cannot die. Or if by any means it be now trodden down so that it die, it will rise to the life everlasting again. Nevertheless, it is as a poem only that I wish for this work to be judged after I am dead.
Right.
And so in the course of this amazing, exquisite development, and sure, in hindsight, you could say scientifically in the facts, there might be some fallacies that he didn't know about in 1848, 49 when he was writing this. But the method of thinking is very much ingrained in things that we've seen from like Plato's Timaeus, investigating the method of investigating the mind of the universe, right? And its similarity to the mind of an integrated human being who's able to look at the relationships of Platonic solids and how they relate to the formation of elements, planets, orbits, whatever. So he's going through, he's like, well, we need to discover like, what are the laws of the universe? And he cites this wonderful, paradoxical, ironic quality that people like Cusa, and he cites Blaise Pascal, who plays with this idea, zeroed in on, of a universe, he says, which is likened metaphorically to a sphere of which its center is everywhere, the circumference nowhere. And he's like, but this definition is no definition of the stars we see, but we may accept it still with some mental reservation as a definition rigorous enough for all practical purposes of the universe proper, that is to say, of the universe of space. The latter, then, let us regard as a sphere of which the center is everywhere, the circumference nowhere. That right there is a wonderful self-contradictory idea, but it's so poetic because it's like the idea of putting no matter where you would position yourself as an observer in the universe, he's saying, looking out in all 360 degrees around you, it would still appear as though you're in the center of the universe, which is a development, again, by Pascal, earlier by Cusa, earlier by Kepler. And so there's a boundedness by the idea sphere, which has, a bounded quality to it, but at the same time, an idea of unboundedness coexisting right with that idea.
Right.
And with that, he also takes us through other seemingly opposing ideas that coexist, like the one and the infinite and the many, which is, again, treated by all of these great thinkers in history, where he starts you off as an observer on a mountaintop, saying, imagine that you're on the mountaintop looking around at the world around you, and it seems like you're one person, but there's all of these infinitely diverse things to look at around you, but start spinning and spin faster and spin faster and spin faster. And he's like, at a certain point, all of the many, the infinite, become increasingly a one as you're spinning at this infinite speed around you. It's like, now extrapolate that. And so he's taking you through these vicarious devices.
They're thought experiments.
These thought experiments, exactly, that open up new thought concepts that you wouldn't have had otherwise, that allow you to unite the one and the many, the infinite and the finite. And it's through a bunch of wonderful jumping back and forths and these types of poetic images that he allows your mind to then create a new mental ecosystem in which certain concepts of God that couldn't have existed before can now arise.
Yeah, and I have a quote on the internet. Do you have that one? Let us begin then at once.
No.
Can I? Yeah, I based on what you're saying. This is from Eureka. He says, "Let us begin then at once with that merest of words, infinity. This, like God, spirit, and some other expressions of which the equivalents exist in all languages, is by no means the expression of an idea, but of an effort at one. It stands for the possible attempt at an impossible conception. Man needed a term by which to point out the direction of this effort, the cloud behind which lay forever invisible the object of this attempt. A word, in fine, was demanded, by means of which one human being might put himself in relation at once with another human being and with a certain tendency of the human intellect. Out of this demand arose the word infinity, which is thus the representative, but of the thought of a thought."
Lovely. Yes, that's exactly. Oh, that really, that's a wonderful quote. And yeah, the thought of a thought, thinking about thinking, is really the key to get at this idea of a Platonic higher hypothesis, right? Which
Right.
People who are going to be enslaved or manipulatable, they are out of touch with the part of their identity that's associated with the thinking side of themselves, and they don't know how to think about thinking itself.
Yeah.
And look back on that, which he does, and he gets at the yearning too, right? That what's more important than the simple fixed set of relationships of things that exist in some ephemeral now, right? He's like, what's more important and more fundamental is the yearning for becoming more than what is now, the yearning for this transcendental thing that's always outside of the fixed realm of being in any given moment. And I think also later on he talks about the idea of God's mind as being more than simply the laws of nature, because it's the thing that create the unifying simple substance that gives meaning and infuses order and purpose to the manifold laws of creation, as being more than simply the sequence of time. It's being, and he describes the simultaneity of all eternity when you start thinking in those higher terms of God's mind, which exists in all past, all future, everything. And I thought that the parting thought that he sort of, it's really great to just leave us on this point before transitioning, I believe, unless you want to talk about this a bit more, is this wonderful quote at the end.
Well, hang on, just to add on, based on what you said, because you talked about this yearning, and I mean, this idea of yearning comes back in the discussion of poetry, but the way you're talking about it more from a scientific standpoint. And I feel like some people might hear that and be like, well, no, you're supposed to be dispassionate, you're supposed to be sort of objective. But if you don't have a yearning for something beyond you, right? If you're just, a plebeian sort of peasant-minded person, that I have nothing against peasants, that's not what I'm trying to say, but if your desires are essentially limited to only what's within your immediate domain of experience, how are you ever going to discover something new? The whole idea of science, right, is that you're going beyond what is within the realm of the known. Which in sense perceptual terms, because within your locality, within your neighborhood, your family, your friends, all these good things. But if you really want to have a society that sees fundamental changes, leaps in knowledge, a society driven by Eurekas, there has to be that yearning. There is no proper scientific method if we don't have a society that has a thirst,
Yeah.
yearning for something what Poe says is in the distance.
Yeah.
Right? And maybe I think this is a good time to just throw in this quote, and then we continue.
Okay. Because I got a quote to end, but if you got a quote, okay, go for it.
You go with it.
All right, because I think that this quote really is just such a nice unifying resolution to the. He knows that he's building up paradoxes in your mind. He knows that throughout the entire long essay. But and I'm not saying this. I'm not doing this to try to like screw up the punchline for people, but it's really to inspire them to actually read it through and activate this in their own mind by reading the essay. But
regardless, so it takes work regardless. Even if you give us an answer, it means nothing unless we really
exactly
have found a way to know whether it's true or not.
Yes. And so dealing now with poetry, art, and science, he says here, it is the poetical essence of the universe which in the supremeness of symmetry is but the most sublime of poems. Now symmetry and consistency are convertible terms. Thus poetry and truth are one. Think the Ode on a Grecian Urn, right? Truth is beauty is truth. A thing is consistent in the ratio of its truth, true in the ratio of its consistency. A perfect consistency, I repeat, can be nothing but an absolute truth. We may take it for granted then that man cannot long or widely err if he suffer himself to be guided by his poetical, which I have maintained to be his truthful in being his symmetrical instinct. He must have a care, however, lest in pursuing too heedlessly the superficial symmetry of forms and motion, that is the physical symmetries that our senses can pick up, which is superficial, he leaves out of sight the really essential symmetry of the principles which determine and control them. So there, even though he's saying like this whole absolute truth, this perfect symmetry, this is something which we can never fully attain, but we're always yearning more towards, to becoming more in harmony with, like tuning ourselves without ever being able to reach that.
To be in an ever more perfect union with the universe.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. So it redefines like what the more perfect union principle. What was it that the founding fathers, Benjamin Franklin, who constructed that more towards a more perfect union idea that was the basis of the constitutional preamble, and the Declaration of Independence.
It's a symmetry of thought, right? That Poe is describing here. It's not a symmetry of material things.
No, exactly.
Among immaterial things, and
a symmetry between the harmony of our soul, which has different aspects to it. You know, of the rational side, the feeling side, the passions that unite the both. And he's talking about the harmonization of all of these components together as a symmetry. That's what he's developing.
Right. And I mean, yeah, we're every time we're throwing around the word soul, right? Okay, I feel like people are here. There's people have so many ideas about this, but I think we have to take it in context of what Poe's saying, not in, I think people have all these ideas of like fossilized or formalized religions or dogmatic forms or approaches to something like the question of the soul. But if the idea is Poe is approaching something immaterial, there is this immaterial yearning, and there's a way to investigate its immaterial characteristics. And the idea of symmetry, right, a symmetry of thoughts, is very interesting in that we're trying to discover a symmetry in the universe, which we are trying to bring ourselves in ever more perfect harmony with, right? The more we discover about the universe, the more the human species is able to sort of adapt its behavior, to change its behavior in recognizing these higher laws. I mean, maybe riding bikes causes cancer, so we're not going to ride bikes anymore. But that's a crazy example. But you know what I mean? The more we discover about how galaxies form, or, many of the paradoxes that exist around, whether fusion, right, the nature of light, when we make fundamental breakthroughs on these things, it will change the way our society organizes itself. And so there's a symmetry of idea there. All that to say that all these things that we're talking about that can be seen as material sort of developments within the bounds of the finite world, they're ultimately only possible because there is this higher symmetry of ideas that is being discovered, the symmetry between our thoughts and how the universe actually functions.
Yeah.
Right. And so that's what truth is all about.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I mean, I think this conception is indispensable for, I mean, in poetry, it often comes naturally, right? In the arts, the poet isn't necessarily going to consciously think everything we've just described, but they are going to respond to that innate yearning. In a sense, art is like it's a special kind of science, right? Or it's a more sort of primal or instinctual science, which deals more with that immediate yearning within and to capture something beyond. Whereas in science, it becomes directed at the actual external universe and trying to sort of understand how using this longing to make sense of things outside us. Right.
Well, I always enjoyed this definition by the late philosopher Lyndon LaRouche, who his writings. I mean, there's some really profound epistemological concepts in his writings, and on the issue of art and science. I like the definition of science as being the study of mankind coming to better and better know the universe ever more perfectly, and arts being the domain of mankind coming to ever never better more understand the universe of his own nature. So our own internal universe, which we call the subjective, but it has certain laws, certain principles that organize it that we can study and perfect.
Right.
As we understand it, we can willfully improve those inner harmonies of that inner universe, and then we find a corollary in our power to accelerate our understanding to the invisible structures organizing the external so-called objective universe. And there's a reciprocity, right, of the objective and subjective that always dynamically play on each other.
Finite and the infinite.
The finite and the infinite, right? Like we are being the microcosm of the macrocosm, that we are the condensed expression of the willful, self-organized part of the universe that can willfully organize in a sort of directioned way willfully, whereas everything else in the universe, whether it's the biosphere, other living matter, the physical matter of chemistry in around stars, star formation, galaxy formation, that's not animated by cognitive human creative components. They're organized without the free will component. They're organized according to those laws. They have certain rhythms, repetitions, harmonies, but they don't self-reflect and change willfully their behavior according to anything external to themselves. Right. So that's purely human beings, and that's very special. It's very lawful, and it does have certain ramifications on how we choose to organize economically, politically, our society in accordance to what standards, right? And are they in harmony with an imperial system of logic of Hobbes or Mackinder, the founder of modern geopolitics, who's shaped people's thinking on both the left and the right side of the spectrum? How in harmony with their thinking is that? And we'll find that generally it's much more in harmony with a very different mode, which is more in alignment with how Benjamin Franklin was thinking about international law, or Abraham Lincoln, or Franklin Delano Roosevelt, or John F. Kennedy, who all had a very different paradigm, a different conception of the self-interest of each nation and each part of each nation with a whole. Much more in harmony with those discoverable laws of nature.
Well, I mean, it's interesting to think, because going back to this idea of imperialism, the denial of immaterial ideas, of universal principles, right? That justice isn't just a construct, but that it's actually something that has to be respected by the human species in the universe. And when there is not justice, bad things happen, and I mean, it helps. There are different scales at which we can look at that. I mean, Poe has fun looking at what happens to psychos or people with really bad sort of internal obsessions. And when they're not able to sort of break out of that kind of logic, the logic of their obsessive behaviors, it leads to all sorts of crazy things, right? But you can also talk about it in terms of empires and the way empires reduce entire populations. They reduce them to basically serfs and slaves, right? And how that ultimately leads to the empire's own demise, and usually a lot of murder, right? Because you can't really control things anymore. Everything's spinning out of control, and the only way to try and bring back order to this total chaos, that the mayhem that you've sort of been sowing for years, I mean, ultimately you can't. It sort of all unravels.
Yeah. Well, your idea of peace in that thought matrix is a piece of the grave, as Kennedy said, right? Not the positive peace that we want to cultivate, of a positive principle of mutual self-interest in a harmony of interests of a global family, right? United with common universal characteristics and desires that bring us together and allow us to transcend our differences. That doesn't exist in the mind of somebody who thinks the way your oligarch thinks. For them, peace is really an absence of action, right?
Yeah, and there's no right, and all that to say, so that in the imperial mindset, we got done away with beauty, justice, the pursuit of happiness, life, liberty, and you just see that. You see what happens when you get rid of these concepts. Ultimately, it's everything breaks down. It's bound. People, I think a lot of in terms of literature with the modernist movement, you know what? It took 100 years for everything to break down, but it has broken down, right? People just wanted to focus on the text. They wanted to just obsess and idolize language. Odin said, poetry does nothing, right? And so it's just about the direct text and the experiences that are generated as literary effects. But if you project that out over time, right, by sort of rejecting any sort of higher idea, you're going to have to leave soon, I guess.
No, I just saw my computer's about to die. That's why.
Oh, okay.
Finish your thought, and then I'm going to run and get my plug.
Yeah, anything goes, right? If you get rid of those concepts, then basically everything the empire does is okay. You could say it's mean, but if it's not actually, if there's no justice, I mean, it just sucks for the people that it's happening to, but who cares?
Exactly.
Right. So
yeah, exactly.
We need a higher.
Hold that thought.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
All good. All right.
So
sorry.
I feel like I felt like I had some thought that I wanted to express, which is why I was saying what I was saying. But yeah, I kind of lost that thought, which is fine.
All right.
But yeah, we're back to, we're gonna do like the monarchs. We're at year 0 now, so we're starting. We have to rediscover everything. I would recommend to everybody to go watch Matthew's class on the real Edgar Allan Poe, who he actually was, who his connections within the intelligence circles that were fighting to keep the ideas of the American Republic alive, right? And how Poe was really the vanguard of trying to basically set up the kind of artistic culture that could generate the kinds of artistic insights which are necessary to fight for these higher kinds of political ideals. And how, yeah, ultimately, this is what I wanted to say in whichever way before, that the imperial subversion of that is what makes possible sort of poo-pooing, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and ultimately saying that, there are slaves, there are masters. Like, you can't prove that wrong without a conception of justice. You can say you don't like it, you can say it's mean, but guess what? The mean people are going to crush and enslave you and your children. So at a certain point, you need a longing. You need a yearning that's going to say, well, you might even have to die for this, but you're recognizing that you are responding to something that's higher, and you sort of recognize that.
Yeah.
But you need a poetic faculty, ultimately. That's what a poetic faculty is. If you don't have a poetic faculty, you can't really recognize these things.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, yeah, this might lead into a future podcast that we might want to have in the coming weeks, dealing with the attack on this very demonstrable quality of humanity and its relationship to our political emancipation, through the arts and the sciences and their relationship. But so there's these very verifiable elementary facts that anybody can study, come to understand, and deploy and use to perfect their own self-development and just enjoy the fruits of that. That's something we can all access. But one of the biggest inhibitors that's been put artificially in the path towards that very fruitful process has been the creation, especially throughout the 20th century and especially after World War II, of things like the Congress for Cultural Freedom, and certain things that the CIA, which was created in 1947, was induced to do as far as cultural warfare, which is highly acknowledged at this point. I mean, this has been written about in many books, many articles have studied, and this has been openly acknowledged by the CIA itself, how modern arts, abstract art, atonal music, all sorts of things like that in all branches of the arts were cultivated with CIA funding after World War II in the combat against the communist Red Scare, which it was seen that the arts was going to be the battleground of where we would get access to our understanding of who we are as a capitalist West versus who they are as a communist East. Right. And I was just writing an article as a teaser, maybe for that future discussion we could have on the creation of the Cold War. And there was a quote that struck me when I was looking at something called, in Canada, we had this espionage counterintelligence operation called Camp X, just in the outskirts of Ottawa, where it was set up by British intelligence to train spies. And they conducted all sorts of things that involving psychological warfare, propaganda, forgeries, and this is sort of the base out of which came the Five Eyes signals operations later on. And one of the key guys who was a major leader of this under William Stevenson was a guy, Peter Dwyer. He was the head of counter-espionage for the British Security Cooperation Organization that was based in the New York during the war. And he was brought in to run a big chunk of this. And the author of this book, David Stafford, writes, "The man who impressed Ottawa with his love of the arts had also played an important part in the history of Anglo-Canadian secret intelligence." That was an interesting statement. So I looked into who this guy is. And indeed, he was one of the co-founders of the Canadian Council of the Arts and Literature that was created in 1957 to take sort of federal responsibility from the Rockefeller and Carnegie foundations and the CIA that had formerly been funding primarily the arts, humanities, sociology in Canada, going back to like 1911. It took control of that and made it a sort of federal thing. And he became the head, what was he? The arts coordinator on the executive council of this thing and a co-founder early on. So you're like, well, is that a coincidence that this guy, who was one of the key figures who organized the creation of the Cold War,
just like art, Matthew. He just liked art. Stop.
Yeah, did he really just objectively just really like art that had nothing to do with his political identity? See, so it's not just the good guys, so-called. I mean, I'm using the word good guys here, but I'm assuming after this conversation, people know that we're not using the naive definition of good guys versus bad guys like from a comic book. But it's not just those people who had a positive effect like Ben Franklin or Poe, whose political identities were tied to their creative output, but rather also on the negative side of things, people like this, you'll find all over the place. You can't talk about the artistic creations of an Emerson or a Carlyle or Peter Dwyer's artistic sponsorship and passions from their political identities. What role, what ideals politically did they see, and how do they situate their own role and identity within a political process in their own lifetimes? They're two sides of the same coin.
Right. Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's a dimension that has to be looked at.
It has to be. Yeah.
At the least.
And so, like I said, maybe for a future conversation, we could maybe like unpack that a lot more.
Yeah. I mean, the whole point of art, I think it's just, we just need to make the distinction, right? The art is not political in that it's not vote for candidate this, or, you know, we need to, you know, whatever, whether it's shut down ICE, or, you know, a poem on shut down ICE, or a poem on the Cold War. Like, no, that's very naive. That's not the role of the artist per se. But to understand the higher strategic dynamics, the different currents of thought, the different philosophical ideas that ultimately shape the interactions in the real world, right? That shape people's thinking, which shape their actions, and which shape events. You can't really get away from that when you're looking at art. Art is actually one of the key battlegrounds. And I mean, whether you're an evil oligarch, smart oligarch like Aldous Huxley or Bertrand Russell, or, you know, you're some high-level manager, anybody who's intelligent, who's trying to sort of control people, understands that art is important. And I mean, if you don't get that, that's okay, but it is. And with that said, I feel like, and maybe this will be a tradition that can be carried on, I think I'd close with a lovely Poe poem from his earlier years, which sort of, based on everything we've been discussing, I think it gives a poetic sense of what that might, you know, an essence of what the struggle is all about. So this is To One in Paradise. Thou wast all that to me, love, for which my soul did pine. A green isle in the sea, love, a fountain and a shrine, all wreathed with fairy fruits and flowers, and all the flowers were mine. Ah, dream too bright to last, ah, starry hope that didst arise, but to be overcast. A voice from out the future cries, on, but o'er the past, dim gold, my spirit hovering lies, mute, motionless, aghast. For alas, with me the light of life is over. No more, no more, no more. Such language holds the solemn sea to the sands upon the shore. Shall bloom the thunder-blasted tree, or the stricken eagle soar? And all my days are trances, and all my nightly dreams are where thy dark eye glances, and where thy footstep gleams. In what ethereal dances, by what eternal streams? There's definitely something, I think, that really speaks to the spirit of Poe, somebody who's struggling with these questions of the infinite and using poetry as a means of really wrestling with these concepts and being able to produce, to develop them in a non-literal way, give people the non-literal tools and means of wrestling with ideas. So I thank you, Matt, for being yet another fascinating guest for the new Lyre. We love all our guests, and yeah, we hope to see you and all our guests again soon. So thank you, everybody, for listening, and we'll be back again next week.
Thank you, Dave. And thank you for doing this. This is a very wonderful project that you've put into motion. I think Poe would be very proud of you.
Thank you.